Two friends are sitting in a pub, and it's late in the evening, and the championship basketball game comes on the television. And they watch as the team scores a basket to go 2 points ahead with less than a second to go. And the commentator says, the game's over. There's no way the other team can win now. And the friend leans across to his buddy and says, I'll bet you $10 that they do win. And his friend says, I'll take that bet. And they watch in stunned silence as they pass the ball, throw it, and make 3 points from their own half of the court. Immediately, the friend reaches for his wallet, takes out $10, and gives it to his friend, who says, I can't take that. This is a repeat. I saw them make the shot earlier. But his friend says, no, you have to take it. I also saw the game earlier, but I didn't think he could do it again. We watch some things happen, and we can hardly believe our eyes. So much so that we watch them again and again and again and expect to see a different result. And yet we know that nothing will change, and that unfortunately, sometimes everything remains the same. The quote often attributed to Albert Einstein is that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. This is not an approach that any of us would ever advocate. Instead, in our society, we are constantly told to learn from our mistakes so that we can avoid repeating them. As a parent, when my daughter Gabby does something accidentally the first time, I am far more sympathetic than when she repeats the same action again and again and again. Some lessons in life are easy to learn. When I failed to see the signs and got pulled over for doing a U-turn on Main Street, I immediately learned a valuable and expensive lesson and have made sure never to repeat my driving indiscretion. But we know that it is not always easy to learn from our mistakes. I know that personally, all too often, I leave things until the last minute and then get stressed when doing them. I won't tell you exactly when I was writing this sermon. But despite the best of intentions to get everything done earlier, all too often I fall into the same trap, repeat the same mistakes, and receive the same results. And what we do as individuals, we also do communally in far wider contexts. This Shabbat is the one closest to Yom HaShoah, the day when we in the Jewish community remember the Holocaust and that most dark of times in our people's history. As our people emerged from the death camps of Europe, a rallying cry began to spread as we collectively said, never again. According to Raoul Hilberg, a historian of the Holocaust, the phrase never again first appeared on handmade signs that the inmates of Buchenwald displayed in April 1945, shortly after the camp had been liberated by US forces. He said later on in his career that perhaps it was really the communists who were behind the signs seen in that camp. Whatever the origins of the phrase, it doesn't matter. Never again has become a rallying cry in response to the Holocaust. And what is most important about these two words is that they were never intended to be limited to never again will there be a Holocaust against the Jews. The words never again were the rallying cry in 1948 when the United Nations General Assembly passed the Genocide Convention to protect all peoples. They are the words that have been recited in the face of persecution, racism, discrimination, and genocide against any group within society since that darkest of time in Europe. It is a powerful call to action. The problem is that all too often these words fall on deaf ears, and the words themselves are never enough. The famous Jewish author Isaac Bashevis Singer wrote, "We know what a person thinks not when they tell us what they think, but by their actions." As a Jewish community and as a world, we are very good at saying never again. But do our actions demonstrate that that commitment is real? This week we discovered that the Allies knew about the Holocaust in the concentration camps much earlier than had previously been known. Newly accessed materials from the United Nations, not seen for around 70 years, show that as early as December 1942, the US, UK, and Soviet governments were aware that at least 2 million Jews had been murdered and a further 5 million were at risk of being killed, and were preparing charges accordingly. Despite this, the Allied powers did very little to try and rescue or provide sanctuary to those in mortal danger. These revelations have come about in a new book entitled Human Rights After Hitler, and its author, Dan Plesch, wrote of his access to the United Nations files. The records overturn one of the most important accepted truths concerning the Holocaust, that despite the heroic efforts of escapees from Nazi-occupied Europe, the Allies never officially accepted the reality of the Holocaust and therefore never condemned it until the camps were liberated at the end of the war. They knew what was happening. In 1943, Viscount Cranbourne, a minister in Winston Churchill's war cabinet, said Jews should not be considered a special case and that the British Empire was not able to admit any more. These words are that much more difficult to hear when accompanied by this new knowledge that at the time when he spoke them, the British government were well aware of the mass extermination of Jews in Europe. The British, the Americans, the Soviets, and many others knew what was happening, and yet they did next to nothing to actually save the Jews who were suffering. Today, we unfortunately know about far too many atrocities which are taking place around the world. And as we gather here together and remember Yom HaShoah, how can we say never again when it unfortunately appears to be happening again and again and again? We watch from afar and we expect to see different results, but none emerge. In 70 years, when the history books are written about the war in Syria, about the global refugee crisis, which is larger today than at any time since World War II, and when they talk about concentration camps for gay men in Chechnya, how will we be judged? What will they say about the statements we made and the actions or lack of actions that we took? In 1967, George Steiner said the following words, which with a change of location seem to ring remarkably true still today. He said, "Massacres are also going on right now. And if I cannot comprehend how men in this room did not move in 1940 or 1941, I am not sure I can comprehend why I do not move now when certain things are going on in Asia at the very moment when I am speaking. This evening we'll go to our friends, to our dinners, to our good sleep, while torture is going on and many human beings are being burned alive. And the great difference is this. It is at least conceivable that when the first news got through about Auschwitz, and there is some evidence on this, there was not actually in the minds of those who heard it the possibility of believing it. It seemed outside the categories of understanding. We who come after know that whatever the news is, it may be so. Whatever the massacre, the torture, the children being burned now in our name, it may be so. I think it is our job as Jews, if anywhere in the world human beings are being burned alive, to ask ourselves, how can we sit still? It seems to me no coincidence that Yom HaShoah and the festival of Pesach come so closely together in the Jewish calendar. The central message of Pesach, which we celebrated just a week ago, is that we were slaves in Egypt. We have personally experienced persecution and suffering. We bear those scars, we carry that memory with us, and behave and live our lives as people who were once slaves, who once suffered all of these terrible atrocities. And the message of Yom HaShoah, so closely on its heels, is that thousands of years later, our people were persecuted, attacked, and slaughtered again. Together, Pesach into Yom HaShoah are a call to action to learn the lessons from the past and to ensure that the words "never again" are always accompanied by action. Commemorating Yom HaShoah while we remain silent about the refugee crisis across the globe feels inappropriate in some ways. Speaking about the concentration camps in Europe while doing nothing about the concentration camps in Chechnya today feels like a betrayal of the memory. And standing here and saying "never again" when we allow genocide to happen again and again is simply unacceptable. George Santayana famously said, "Progress, far from consisting in change, depends on retentivism. When change is absolute, there remains no being to improve, and no direction is set for possible improvement. And when experience is not retained, as among savages, infancy is perpetual. Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." We are a people of memory. We remember the past, and as such, we have an obligation to ensure that the rest of the world does not forget. And through this memory, we must do all that we can to make sure that the mistakes of the past are not repeated. In 70 years' time, books will be written about this period of American and Jewish and global history. What will they write about us, about our words, and about our actions? Shabbat Shalom. If I could now ask Amy Sirotkin with the announcements on behalf of the board of the community.